Greetings. Welcome to ITR Live. I'm your host, Chris Hagano, and welcome back to another fun-filled, action-packed, snowy episode. We are here in studio today with John Hendrickson and Sarah Curry, and we've got a lot planned for you today. Before we kick things off, we always have fun. We get to the really good stuff before we even hit record here. And so we went through a fashion discussion and could not arrive at a common understanding of what an ascot is. And so we'll go to the fashion desk with John Hendrickson to kick things off. And John, do you own an ascot?
No, I don't.
Okay. Do you own a scarf?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Do you wear it?
Yeah, in fact, it's on the coat rack.
Oh, okay,
it's a nice plaid one.
Yeah, good.
Oh, I see it. It is nice.
Yeah.
A good tartan color.
Yeah.
No, Sarah is wearing her scarf today, looking sharp as she braved the snowy weather on her drive in this morning. But John, does this level of winter weather even register for you?
No, this is nothing.
This is nothing.
Yeah.
Remind our listeners, we talk about it a lot, but where is home?
It's northern Minnesota.
Northern Minnesota, the Iron Range. And so we're getting a dusting here. It's maybe accumulating a little bit, but what's going on back home today?
They had over a foot of snow this morning.
Yeah. And that just starts the pile a little earlier.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
How big on an average winter does the pile at the end of the driveway get? Like how tall can that get?
Where you can't even see a vehicle.
Yeah. And so it's just that battle all winter of getting the pile high enough that you can still get the car in the driveway, right?
I remember one winter, my brother and I, we were shoveling roofs for extra money, and we didn't even need a ladder. You just climb on the
That's a thing.
People
do that.
Wow.
Yeah.
You can tell I was raised in the South.
Yeah.
Is that something that everyone has to do, is clear roofs off?
Oh, yeah, because it's the snow gets so heavy it can cause damage.
Yeah. No, no, that makes sense. It's a different world up there for sure. Yeah. We are sort of fortunate, I think, at Central Iowa that you're sort of at that edge of the boundary of whether snow sticks around all winter, and it will, and then it won't. But it's definitely a half of the year sort of a thing.
I almost say it's worse here because of the ice factor.
Yeah.
Haha, ice.
Yeah.
See, coming from the South, they just say snow and everything shuts down and you don't leave your house. But yeah, we actually got ice storms. So when I first moved out here, I was like, so what do you do when the power's out for a week? They're like, what are you talking about? It's like, well, the ice storms. They're like, well, that doesn't happen here. We just get snow. No. I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah. No, it's far easier to try and get around in the snow than the ice for sure.
Yeah.
No, I have some family from, Oklahoma. I don't know if you'd consider that the South, but the ice snow freaked them out. None of that family would come up to visit. They were 6 months out of the year like, nope, sorry, you guys got to come down here. So anyway, all right, enough of the winter weather. I'd like to say it's warm and toasty here, but inside the conference room in the ITR studio, but sadly it's a little chilly still. I know, we got to get warmed up. We may not make it through this one. John's been giggling straight here for the better part of a minute. Okay, let's talk shop. Session's around the corner, and one of the things that the legislative session will focus on is the state budget, and the beginning of that is the December Revenue Estimating Conference estimate, where the 3-person panel gets together and provides their estimate of what state revenue looks like for the next fiscal year and for the one following. So we have that estimate. It was released, I guess, yesterday as we're recording this on a Thursday. And John, kind of take us through where the Revenue Estimating Conference sees state revenue going.
Yeah, it was actually a very, I think, the quickest REC meeting that I've seen.
Yeah, it really was. I think they were in and out of there in 10 to 15 minutes.
But excuse me, revenue is looking fairly good. They set the limit a little bit lower, which is $9.6 billion, which will be what the governor sets her budget by. But then actually the revenue, I think, was about 1.92% higher And so, but really, when you look at the projections, the taxpayer relief funding will continue to grow. The reserve accounts are all full. And so it's really a good shape. And I think this is a credit. I know we've talked a lot about on this program, the governor's prudent budgeting. And this really is a credit to her and the legislature for basically keeping spending in check while at the same time providing for the priorities of government. And so I think this forecast going into the session is very good news, especially with all the economic uncertainty. In fact, I couldn't believe it, but this morning in the Wall Street Journal, the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has an article basically saying that President Biden is righting the ship of the economy, which I don't agree with. But, there's a lot of good economists that are saying there's a possible threat of recession. I think I was prepared, and we heard that from the members of the REC yesterday, too. So very good forecast. And, the other thing is that there's a lot of, especially Iowa Democrats, saying, well, look at this. It's not really leading, revenue is not growing. But keep in mind that this is incorporating the tax cuts as well. And so this is money that's going back to the taxpayer.
Well, yes, when you cut taxes, there's less money going to government. That's by design. So, Sarah, we talked about this a little bit in pre-production, but the top line revenue number is close to unchanged in there. Or once you put a much better point on this than I did about thinking about the implementation of the tax bill and where revenues are at.
Yeah. So when you cut taxes, you're going to have a reduction in revenue, and there's always forecasts, and economists all look at this. And so when we compare it to what's actually happening and what's coming in, we're collecting more than we anticipated. So the tax cuts are costing less than we thought.
Yes.
That's a way to look at it. So yes, there's a reduction in revenue. There was supposed to be a reduction in revenue, but it's reducing less than we thought because the economy is so strong. And so if we go back to when the tax cuts were enacted, which was March, think about it. We didn't have the inflation we have today. We didn't have the looming recession, or as strong of a looming recession as we do today. And our economy is doing really, really well. So when you look at that fiscal impact of these tax cuts, they're not as stark or as deep, I guess, as the Democrats are saying, as one might have thought then. And so Iowa was in a really good situation in March when they enacted these tax cuts, and we're even better today. So I don't think this is anything to worry about. I actually think it's really good news.
Yeah, I do too. John, you've got the revenue memo from the Legislative Services Agency in front of you. What is the big number of anticipated revenue for fiscal year 23 that we're going into? Is it 9.4-ish billion?
Yeah, I'm trying to find it on here.
I think it was 9.4 and change.
Yes, okay. That's correct. Yeah.
Last year's state budget was $8.2 billion.
Yeah.
Now, there will be some new expenses in the state budget. It will grow a little bit year over year. And as we've said time and again, the legislature does a really good job of restraining that. But think about that going into fiscal year 23, you got $9.4+ billion in revenue on a baseline budget of $8.2 billion. The state will continue to generate a huge surplus next year. And the Revenue Estimating Conference gives us a sneak peek at fiscal year 24, which would start another year out. And that was relatively unchanged. But going back to Sarah's point, there's another significant chunk of tax decreases that are incorporated into that one. And that's where I think it's really hard to put this into, a short word on a podcast. But that expected loss of revenue is substantially less than what we thought, and that's even more pronounced a year out. And so maybe the big point is these tax cuts were affordable when they were passed. They were dependent on the idea that Iowans are paying more in their taxes than the state needs to operate. And that is even stronger. That dynamic is even more pronounced today than it was 8 months ago when they passed the tax bill.
Yeah, because and for those of you that don't know, when tax cuts or any type of fiscal impact is forecast, it's forecast for multiple years. And so, yeah, you're right. Looking at fiscal year 24, and I anticipate fiscal year 25, Iowa was expecting a significant drop in revenue, and decisions were going to have to be made to cover that. And I don't think that's going to happen now. Right. I mean, I'm not looking at a crystal ball that is different from anybody else's. I'm just looking at the hard numbers here. And I don't see a big drop in our revenue. And if we have a national recession, I don't think Iowa's going to be as affected as the rest of the country is, just because we have agriculture in our economy, which is different. And we're going to rebound really fast, because I do think America's growing and we're strong, and people are going to come back to the labor force. And this is all going to, I think we're going to come back here in 3 years and say, what tax cuts? We're just living the dream.
Yeah, I think that's right. If you look at for our listeners that don't operate inside the Capitol and how things function, when there is a piece of legislation that impacts the money, the Legislative Services Agency will issue something called a fiscal note, which is it's their estimate of, if you spend this amount of money, that comes with an impact, or if you cut taxes, it will cost the state budget a certain amount of money. And so that's what we use to look at how much was the tax bill going to impact the state budget. And if you look into the out years, fiscal year 27, 28, that's a big number. It's north of $1.5 billion in total.
When you add it up year after year.
Of a reduction to the state general fund. But as we just saw, we're already paying $1.2 billion more in taxes than we need. I've repeated this before, is that these tax cuts are built on that excess payment of taxes by Iowans. And when you see Democrats and it's not even just Democrats, I don't want to just say it that way, they get really nervous about they see that big number in a projected loss of revenue, and they spread the doom and gloom. It feels like it's just because they see the loss in the ability to spend. And that's the difference. Not that there is a real concern for the health of the budget, because we've already here in a few minutes established that the budget is strong and healthy. They just have less money to spend, which is a good thing. And it's a feature, not a bug.
Yeah. And I'm going to throw a little bit more wonky stuff on there. So when you're doing tax reform or tax changes, there's a couple ways to look at it. You can have tax cuts, which is where you actually cut the revenue. Then it's revenue neutral, where you just kind of change some things around, but the revenue all stays the same. And then there's a revenue increase, where we change the tax rates and we collect more. And Iowa enacted tax cuts, which means we are looking at a reduction of revenue. But looking at this revenue forecast at the present time, 1.9% is a really, really small number. I would almost argue at this point in time, it's still early yet, but like, we're actually looking at revenue neutral changes, which means there's not going to be these stark cuts to revenue. The state's going to be able to invest in its core responsibilities. And if it does turn out in a year or so that this was a revenue neutral cut because our economy's so strong, that's just ammunition for more reforms down the road.
Well, yes. And that's something that, John, you and I have talked about. Governor Reynolds has already started talking about the path to zero. And when you have this amount of strength in the budget and you see these collections coming in, that becomes more and more realistic going forward. So this is 1 year, it's one look in time, but it's unchanged from the estimate that we saw 2 months ago. And it is all good news, I think, about where Iowa's at in our national economy and where we're at going forward.
And I just want to let our listeners know, the foundation, we look at these revenue reports every single month and how it's impacting the state. And every time there's an REC meeting, we're going to dive into it and try to put it on our website. So if people that aren't as nerdy as us, but they want to keep up with what's going on.
I'm a cool guy.
Yeah. We're going to report on it.
So I want to use that as the segue into a couple of the other things that I wanted to talk about today. Is you talked about when you do a tax bill, what is that like? And whether it's revenue neutral or a true tax cut. So one of the big conversations at the Capitol next year is going to be on property taxes. Iowans are frustrated at their property tax burden, and the foundation has started releasing a series of pieces that will be part of a broader report coming down, but on ways to limit property taxes. And before we even get into a couple of these ideas, I think that point needs to be reinforced, is that if we're cutting property taxes, it should be a reduction in what we're paying and what government has available to spend. And so a true cut in property taxes is going to restrain local government. It is going to have less dollars on the table rather than just paying for it in one place or another. And as we've come back to, for example, 2 years ago when the legislature picked up the tab for mental health care services that had been paid for with property taxes and now is paid for at the state level. Well, yes, in most cases, or many cases, that did result in a property tax payment, but the burden was simply shifted to the state general fund. And so when we talk about property tax reform, I know the three of us at this table believe that it should involve true cuts and not just shifting burdens off onto the state general fund.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay.
We hear all the time, I want property tax relief. Well, do you really want relief or do you want reform? Let's fundamentally change things. And then let's not just keep things status quo. Let's actually give you some more dollars in your pocket.
So real quick because we spent more time on the REC than I had anticipated. But the couple of pieces that are up now that I think folks will find interesting, Sarah, you have spent some time working on the consolidation of property tax levies, because there's not just one. If you go in and look at your bill, you're paying a lot of different property tax levies. So can you just give a quick preview of what folks could find if they go to itrfoundation.org and read the article?
Yeah, sure. So I did a deep dive into our property tax levies. And a lot of people think, oh yeah, cities, counties, schools, they have property tax levies. But actually, there's a lot of little tiny levies that all go into one. And so what you're probably looking at is called the consolidated property tax rate, which is all of those tiny little levies all put together. And what do I mean by that? So cities actually have at their disposal around 30 different property tax levies. And that's because they have their basic, and then they have a supplemental, and then they have a different one for retirees. They have a different one for debt. You can actually have a separate property tax levy for a convention center.
Great.
And so there's a separate levy for a municipal band. So if you're, I think Cedar Rapids has like a municipal band.
Yeah, the band tax. We've talked about that before.
There's actually, dating back to the 1930s, there's a property tax to pay for testing cattle for brucellosis. It's not a lot, but it's still there. And so the important thing to realize is that every single local government in the state of Iowa has the authority to levy a property tax because that authority has been given to them by the state.
Right.
And some of this dates back over 100 years. And so there's some property tax levies that aren't being used right now. So maybe it's time for the state to look at these levies and say, okay, nobody's using this one, or only one or two are using this one. Let's just get rid of it. Let's put it all on that general thing. So that way you can just say, hey, this is the property tax for cities or counties, and this is it. It's everything's in that one number instead of having, 30 different levies all piled into one.
Well, good. So if you want to check that out, again, go to the ITR Foundation website, and there's a lot of more information there. So thanks, Sarah. John, we're going to talk real quick. Actually, I know you've done a lot of work on reduction in tax levies and rate limits. Give us the 30-second preview of that, and then I think we probably should come back on a future episode and build that out a little further. So give us a preview.
I think the main theme that we need to walk away with is that the most effective reform to the property tax system and be focusing on the spending side. And that's where I think where we talk about in this report, applying some sort of fiscal rule limitation on local government spending.
I think that's right. It's not complicated, but if you want to pay less in property taxes, your local government needs to spend less and needs to collect less. And it comes, and I guess I'll close with the idea that I think is overarching all of this, that the message that we want the people of Iowa to hear, and specifically state policymakers, is that over the past several years, the state legislature and the governor have done a commendable job of restraining spending and putting us in a position to make meaningful cuts in taxes and limiting Iowans' tax burden. We live in a red state with many conservative local governments, and it's time for them to follow suit. It is time for them to carry on in that spirit and restrain spending and have that work to the benefit of the property taxpayers in their communities. And that's where we're trying to go with all of this.
Exactly, 100%.
Good. We figured it all out. Job done.
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, John and Sarah, thank you very much. Everyone out there, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell your friends, tell your neighbors, and make sure that as many folks that are interested get this information. And we want to grow it and get it out to everyone. So thanks for being here. And with that, we will see you next time.